JFK knew about UFOs from the end of World War II. He accompanied James Forrestal into Germany before the war had officially ended. So they were looking for stuff, and there was a big race on between not only the Russians to get their hands on German technology, but also the British. CIA wasn't telling him anything, and this is where it goes into Bluegill Triple Prime. The CIA had nothing to do with Operation Dominic, which was the atmospheric nuclear tests. That was a full-on military operation with the Atomic Energy Commission. So when that happened, it forced the CIA's hand because they'd been withholding information from JFK about the alien presence.
As soon as his hand went in, he was telling me it was kind of like Jell-O, but at the same time, it felt like a giant jellyfish. And when his hand went in, as he was pulling his whole arm from the elbow in out, the thing lit up. I mean, he said this gigantic, whatever it was, lit up and started to pulsate with light. It lit up the whole sea bottom.
Welcome back to Emergent. My name is Reed Summers. Welcome to 2026. Happy New Year's. Good to be back with you in the studio with more great guests into the new year as I examine the continued and ongoing interface between our human species and a potential non-human intelligence. Apologies for the holiday cold. My voice is a bit muddled, but nonetheless, I'm very excited for today's conversation. We'll be diving into the JFK UFO connection, the assassination of JFK, Cold War era UFO and USO cases, and we'll be talking about everything from MK Ultra to UFO, UAP shootdowns to the potential intelligence and intent of whatever this phenomenon ends up being. Joining me today is Geoff Cruickshank. Geoff is an energy production technologist and critical infrastructure security specialist with more than a decade of experience working across LNG production, power generation, industrial automation, and high-risk security environments. He has worked as a security consultant and operations technologist in Australia's Northern Territory. Alongside his professional career, Geoff is an independent researcher of Cold War-era UFO and UAP history with a focus on incidents involving nuclear weapons, critical infrastructure, and undersea environments, bringing a technical and systems-level perspective to these cases. He is also the author of a formal submission to the Australian government titled Strengthening the National Security of Australia's Critical Infrastructure, and he publishes ongoing research and analysis on UAPs, national security, and Cold War history through his Substack. I'm excited about today's conversation. I got in touch with Geoff about a year ago when the Declassification Task Force was stood up in the U.S. House of Congress to declassify and give greater transparency into classified information regarding JFK, UAP, and the Epstein files. I view Geoff as an amazing source of historical knowledge and perspective on the JFK era UFO documents that have already come out and that may still be coming out through the declass efforts. In part one of the conversation, we'll be talking about JFK, the JFK assassination, Cold War UAP history, and a key 1962 nuclear event in which an alleged UAP was shot down and then recovered by underwater Navy divers. In part two, we'll go a little bit deeper and talk about the underlying reasons why Kennedy and the CIA fell out over the UAP issue. We'll talk about the great power struggles of 20th century and the geopolitical tensions and dynamics of the Cold War and how the presence and ongoing activity of UAP may be connected to that. We'll also be taking viewer questions from those on Patreon, YouTube members, and my community platform, Forerunner. So I want to thank you in advance if you're a supporter on Forerunner or a member here on YouTube. Helps the show grow. Please like and subscribe, spread this to others, and let's expand this conversation into the wider public as we head into 2026. And with that, onward to the conversation with Geoff. Welcome, Geoff Cruickshank, to Emergent. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Reed. It's been a long time coming.
Yes, it has. We've been in touch for quite some time. I think it was over a year ago that I first got in touch after Congress stood up the Declassification Task Force to bring greater transparency regarding government classified information regarding JFK, UAP, and the Epstein files. A lot has happened since. You've come out on some shows on Ross Coulthart's News Nation, for example, and provided some very compelling history. And I can see that you're extremely well versed in not only the JFK side of the UFO reality, but generally just the Cold War period and how UAP might have played a part either via crash recoveries and reverse engineering or other means in potentially influencing the way that the geopolitical landscape has taken shape in the post-World War II era. So excited to have you on Emergent, where we are examining this human potential non-human interface and the way that information and influence goes in both directions via this exchange. So great to have you, Geoff. Just to get things started, tell viewers about yourself, your professional background, how you got into the UFO field and into this deep historical niche area.
When I was a boy, my father made a fairly large reflecting telescope with an equatorial mount. So back from an early age, I got a very good idea of the enormous size of the universe and the number of stars, in not only our galaxy, but the number of galaxies. So early on, I realized it was statistically impossible for life just to be on one planet in this vast universe. Since that time, discoveries have been made regarding how life evolved, not only on this planet, but potentially on other planets with not using photosynthesis. There's various other mechanisms such as chemosynthesis, where sunlight's not a requirement and therefore distance from a star is not a requirement for life to develop. And recently there was radiosynthesis that discovered organisms that can synthesize food from radiation at the Chernobyl reactor. So that opens up the possibilities that the Goldilocks zone is no longer a requirement for a planet to develop life, as long as there is some sort of geothermal activity on that planet or moon. Even moons of planets have geothermal activity, like Jupiter and Saturn. And, radiation permeates the universe. So the potential for life is everywhere throughout the universe.
Yeah, logical first principles definitely bringing us to this probability that we're not alone. And so how did you get into the UAP UFO topic? And how did you get into this deep dive into Cold War history and the great power struggle and how UFOs are connected to it?
So I did work for an intelligence agency in Australia. Unfortunately, the laws in Australia are so sort of hard. They clamp down so much on that sort of information. I can't actually say who I worked for or what level of clearance I had, but I've always worked in power generation and critical infrastructure. And basically that was my job. I was a contractor. I didn't work directly for the government agency, but my job was to make sure systems worked. That was mainly space-based systems. I live in Darwin in the Northern Territory, which is 12 degrees south of the equator. So for space-based activities, we're very fortunate in where we're positioned. And it's a harsh environment. So keeping power, they call it the 5 nines of power reliability. You need uptime of 99.999% of the time for systems, high-tech systems, to remain stable and do what they've got to do. So that was my job, maintain that power reliability. The systems have also got to maintain a stable environment inside. Darwin is a very hot and humid area, so air conditioning is paramount for cooling systems for data centres. And also the security. I had a special endorsement from a government agency to build and construct facilities for storage of information up to the top secret level. And Darwin now has a permanent US Marine Corps presence here. So I built a facility for their armory for them to store their weapons in. So I had to bridge both the Australian security requirements and the US Marine requirements, which I did successfully. So yeah, basically that's my background. But I'd just like to point out,
your background in hard infrastructure and data and housing of sensitive data, did that bring you into the UFO topic specifically? Because there's a history of UFO apparent interest in such critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I've always been interested in that, just particularly with electromagnetic pulse information. When I left school, I became a diesel mechanic in 1992, and around that time, the California Air Board put out some pretty stringent regulations on pollution requirements, and every diesel engine in California at that time had to be electronically controlled. So if the computers don't work, the engines don't work, and diesels don't actually need electricity to work. They use the heat of compression from the piston to compress and ignite the fuel. It's been noted, and in Harry Turner's, he was an Australian nuclear scientist. He wrote a very large report in 1971 about UFO cases. He noted that diesel engines weren't affected by electromagnetic pulse or electromagnetic interference from proximity to UFOs. But if you add electronic controls to that system, they're no longer immune to electromagnetic activity. So in 1994, I wrote a letter to the Defence Technology and Science Organisation and designed a system that would protect Australian Army trucks, the logistics. Australia's a very large continent, and diesel transport is paramount to getting anything from A to B, and even more so in times of war. So I was concerned that an EMP device detonated, in the upper atmosphere or in space would take out all the Australian Army's capability to fight a war, basically. So I developed a fairly simple device to negate that high pulse that comes in, because an electromagnetic pulse will induce a high current in anything that conducts electricity. So, they weren't really interested. They pretty much wrote the letter and said, please don't contact us again about this subject. It was a bit touchy to them, but they did refer me to a good book that I still use today. So,
well, yeah. Geoff, we're in part 2 of this conversation. For those who would like to take the deep dive, we're going to get into that exact topic Jeff, that you brought up, which is EMP in space-based nuclear high altitude detonations or anti-satellite weaponry, because this is actually kind of an emergent topic in the national security, international security space. And we're going to be exploring whether there is a connection to UAP crash recoveries, the direct energy weapon connection to UFOs. So we'll get into that. I'm excited for it. To open up though, I first took an interest in your work on the JFK files, and it was very clear to me, are a deep file, no pun intended yourself, on this topic of how is JFK connected to the national security establishment and its apparent interest in UFOs, its management of the topic, and the very touchy relationship it and the USSR would have had during the Cold War. So to your knowledge and to the best of your research today, how do you understand the connection between JFK and UFOs, if you were to put it simply to someone who had no knowledge of the topic?
JFK knew about UFOs from the end of World War II, and he accompanied James Forrestal into Germany before the war had officially ended. So they were looking for stuff, and there was a big race on between not only the Russians to get their hands on German technology, but also the British. There was a very big race on, and within the US armed forces, there was the OSS and also the US Army's Alsos mission, which went in to get not only nuclear secrets, but the miracle weapons. And I've got a book from 1954 that was written by a guy named Hans Schaefer. He was a U-boat captain, and he surrendered his U-boat in Argentina in like August of 1945, well after the war in Europe had ended. And he writes about the miracle weapons in his book, which the book I've got was published in 1954. So
He's the
this is a real topic
of the Nazi regime.
Yep, exactly.
Yes, okay.
He talks about them.
And is there any connectivity in terms of, what was being looked for post-war to either the Magenta crash, some of the materials of which apparently were recovered by the Mussolini regime, or any other crashed vehicles of potential non-human origin?
Yeah, that's where I believe that's where it all started. There was the Aurora crash in 1896, but in I think it was Texas. But the Magenta craft came down in 1933, 15 kilometres outside of Milan in Italy. Just happened to be where James Angleton and his family were living at the time. James was about 17. And it crashed outside of the city. James Angleton's mother was Mexican, so she was Catholic, highly religious. Her son's middle name's Jesus or Jesus. The local cardinal in Milan was a guy named Alfonso Schuster. He was chief of the lead knight of the Knights of Malta, which they're a sovereign country. They don't have any land. They're not associated with Malta. They got kicked out of Malta by Napoleon in 1815. They've got an office in the Vatican, and that's their country. They can issue passports. James Angleton and his father were involved in the Knights of Malta even back in the 30s. And this craft,
just for those who don't know, James Angleton, what was ultimately his career position?
He was the secret keeper of the CIA.
Okay.
He was he reported only to the director of CIA. He was the director of counterintelligence, and he held the portfolio on UFOs. He had the UFO files, and it was off the books in the CIA. He had his own record system going there. And when after the church committee, he was forced to retire. It took them 3 years to go through all his safes. They had to crack the safes. They couldn't just open them. They had to get safe crackers in to bust open everything and go through his files. So Angleton was there in 1933. The Germans got hold of the technology. I believe there was some.
People be wondering what did they find in those three safes? Any highlights stand out?
Well, Angleton's successor, I think his name was Tom Colaris. He said he found things in there that he'll never speak about. So, yeah, lots of. They also found autopsy photos of Bobby Kennedy. Like, there was no reason for Angleton to have those photos, and they were curious as to why he had them. But anyway,
deep story.
Yes. So the Germans,
the post-war era,
the Germans and the Italians had this craft. I've been working. There's been a magnificent group of researchers led by Craig Oliver and Michael Armentor that have been going through the files of the OSS because they exfiltrated the craft out of Italy in 1933, the end of the war, back to the US. And these guys are hot on the trail of how that craft that came down got exfiltrated out. I believe there was a fusion reactor in that craft that used heavy water, which is why the Germans were so focused on heavy water. They had a plant in Norway. That was the famous Dam Busters mission, was to destroy that facility. But they were looking for nuclear fusion. They should have been looking for nuclear fission. But the guy in charge of the Italian side, the research side, was a guy named Guglielmo Marconi, famous inventor. He was the lead of RS-33, it was called. It was, I guess it's the equivalent of MJ-12.
Mm-hmm.
But what is interesting is that Marconi died in 1937, and his daughter I believe she's still alive. She said that when her father died, the person that took over the research of that reverse engineering project was Enrico Fermi. Enrico Fermi was a famous physicist that managed to escape Italy in 1938 because he won a Nobel Prize. So he went to Stockholm to collect his Nobel Prize and never went back. He went to the United States, and he was the key man in the Manhattan Project. So
did you articulate the Fermi paradox after or before?
That was after. That was 1954. Yeah.
Right. I would imagine that was post-war, right? So interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So much history here. So catch us back up with JFK. So JFK specifically, he was in Europe with Forrestal. Okay. And how does JFK's journey carry on from there?
Because he was, at the time, Forrestal was Secretary of the Navy. JFK is obviously ex-Navy. So they knew what they were going in there looking for. They had the US Army had the Alsos mission, which was specifically looking for, it was run by General Leslie Groves from Manhattan Project. They wanted to know how far the Germans had got with the atomic weapons. So Forrestal and Kennedy were in there on their own mission looking for miracle weapons. So, the Foo Fighters were well known by the air crews of both sides, Axis and Allies. They wanted to know what the hell they were. That's what they were looking for.
Really? So they were there looking for insight into the Foo Fighter phenomenon, among other things.
Yep.
But
miracle
specifically, weapons. Okay.
Yep.
Was there a supposition that those potential anomalous craft may have been recovered by the Nazis, and that there was a connection to the Wonder Weapon program?
Yes, there was. And one of the people that could speak German that went to the underground facility at Bammergrau outside of Munich, which was the Messerschmitt factory, was a young guy named Henry Kissinger, worked for Army counterintelligence. He debriefed all the Nazi scientists at the time. So old Henry knew from an early stage what was going on. President John F. Kennedy then left and became a congressman in 1946, I believe. He was friends with a guy named Stuart Symington, who was the first Secretary of the Air Force. And one of the reports, it's a majestic document, but it states that a few days after Roswell occurred, and President Truman was asked at a press conference on July 8, 1947 about Roswell, and he tried to make a joke of it. So it was well known. It was in the press. It had gone published in that Roswell Daily Record. Truman was asked about it, and he brushed it off, made a joke of it. But Stuart Symington apparently pulled Congressman Jack Kennedy aside and told him exactly what had gone on with Roswell. So Kennedy knew. The problem was the CIA were not going to tell him anything, and that was his big problem with the CIA. They weren't sharing info because they didn't believe he had a need to know. That's the bottom line.
Okay. And so advance some years, it's the late 50s, now it's the early 60s. We're getting deep into the Cold War. How does JFK's relationship to the CIA mature? How do we get what takes place leading up to his assassination, and what indicators are there that the connection is a very real one, that he knew and the CIA didn't want him to know more, or didn't want him to take certain actions related to it?
So the lead scientist of the CIA, a guy named Dave Christ, for whatever reason, they sent him into Cuba we still don't know what exactly he was doing, and he got captured. So he was the lead scientist on the reverse engineering project, MK Ultra. because MK Ultra
or two different projects, reverse engineering.
Two different.
MK Ultra? Yeah.
MK Ultra was, James Angleton ran the counterintelligence division from 1947, even though the CIA, when it first started, he got put straight in there. He had a young psychiatrist running around with him in the 50s that could apparently hypnotize people just by looking at them straight off the bat. So if you're going to send a spy into a foreign country, you don't want them to reveal anything under torture. So if you program them by hypnotism and send them in, doesn't matter how bad they get tortured, they'll never say anything because their brain is being compartmented by this hypnosis. And that was Angleton's ultimate goal. He said, this is groundbreaking technology. We could send people in behind enemy into Russia, and that's probably what Lee Harvey Oswald did. They programmed him to go in. This psychiatrist by the name, his name was Lewis J. West, otherwise known as Jolly West. He worked for James Angleton. So he's a famous MK Ultra scientist. When Dave Christ got arrested, Angleton panicked because he sent, this is a memo, this is a declassified CIA document that Angleton's asking how much Dave Christ actually knew about, they said Sid's work. Now, Sid was Sidney Gottlieb, who was the chief scientist behind MK Ultra. So they panicked because Dave Christ had the entirety of CIA secrets in his head, and he was incarcerated for 2.5 years, and the Cubans tortured him daily. And just whatever information they got out, they gave to the Soviets.
Mm-hmm. And in your interview with
he got arrested.
You surmised that, who knows, maybe the Bay of Pigs operation was cover to jailbreak him, to get him out, given how much information he had. And so let me just flat out ask the question: was JFK assassinated due to any connection to UAP in your understanding?
Yep. Yeah.
And what specifically was? Yeah.
Because the CIA wasn't telling him anything, and this is where it goes into Bluegill Triple Prime. The CIA had nothing to do with Operation Dominic, which was the atmospheric nuclear tests. That was a full-on military operation with the Atomic Energy Commission. So when that happened, it forced the CIA's hand because they'd been withholding information from JFK about the alien presence. Now Kennedy had, evidence, hard evidence. They'd recovered debris from that shoot down. The CIA was forced to go and brief President Kennedy on what they knew, because otherwise that would have given him leverage to destroy the CIA, which is what that famous quote where he says he wants to destroy them into 1,000 pieces and spread their ashes to the wind. If they didn't come out and say, okay, yep, this is happening, that would have given him an exact reason to shut the whole CIA down.
Was there any aspect to it where JFK or his administration was attempting overtures to the USSR in ways the CIA did not want to have happen?
Yep.
Yeah. Can you give into that geopolitical power play?
This stuff I'm talking about, this is declassified US government documents. It's not me making assumptions. This is hard evidence. And regardless of if I worked in the intelligence game, I could be a janitor at a high school. It doesn't matter. It's not my data. I'm just pointing people to where it is. It's been declassified. There was a basic national security planning meeting in May 1963 where on the agenda, on the front page, it says we are looking at a joint lunar operation with the Soviet Union. And people present were the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a guy named Maxwell S. Hunter. He was hand-picked to head the National Aerospace and Science Council. Maxwell Hunter used to work for Douglas Aircraft Corporation, which made the missiles that were involved in Bluegill Triple Prime. Part of this report, it says they talk about the possibility of encountering alien life when they're doing this lunar exploration with Soviet Union, and they sort of discount the possibility. Well, Maxwell Hunter took offence to that, and he actually wrote a counter memo to the Secretary of State in July 1963 and said, actually, you know what, there's probably a pretty good probability that we are going to encounter an alien life form in our space explorations. This is a top scientist that was handpicked by President Kennedy writing a memo saying, I disagree. And he probably had insight into what happened with Bluegill Triple Prime, because Bluegill Triple Prime, it failed. The Bluegill test failed 3 times previously, and they started blaming the missile, which he designed. Yeah. So he had he was trying to figure out.
That's,
yep.
Yeah.
But these are documents that, you know, from May 1963, President Kennedy was quite obviously going to join forces with the Soviet Union on a lunar mission. It's not speculation.
That stated
fact.
Lunar mission, was that the true story, or is that a cover story for some other collaboration beyond just landing on the moon together?
I'm not sure, but it's to the CIA and the military-industrial complex. That was terrible because their budgets would have evaporated. So they could not let that happen.
I'm curious, are there any documents that have been released at any time which confirm either that UAP UFO have been recovered and have been recovered with biological entities? Has that appeared in any of the documents that you've reviewed?
They're never going to let that happen. This is a document that was found by Craig Oliver and his team, Kelly from the Visitors podcast. They went through General Donovan's files on the 19th of January 2017 looking for stuff, and I think it might have been related to what President Trump said in his first term, that he was going to look at declassified UFO stuff. Why would the CIA go through the files of James Donovan 70 years after World War II, just before President Trump got inaugurated? They have gone through these files over and over again to remove any clue. They tried it with MK Ultra, but they forgot about the financial side. That's how they denied MK Ultra even exists until someone found a document that had the funding, you know, the vouchers for the work. So then they were forced to admit that MK Ultra was real. So they comb these files. Why would the CIA need to go through General Donovan's files in 2017? Because they know that General Donovan's OSS, they got the Magenta craft out of Italy in 1943. The thing is, they didn't get everything. We found more stuff just 3 weeks ago that they missed.
Okay. And what was that?
James Angleton was working with Francis Spellman, Cardinal Francis Spellman, who was a good friend of Cardinal Pacelli, who was involved in the Magenta crash. Cardinal Pacelli was the one that signed the Reichskonkordat with the Nazis in 1933, just a month after the Magenta crash, because I believe, and Pacelli has said this, that the Nazis held a gun to his head, literally. They would have revealed the existence of alien life, which would have destroyed the Catholic Church. So he had no choice but to sign that document. Cardinal Pacelli later on became Pope Pius XII. So Francis Spellman was the abbot of the United States Armed Forces at Roswell. He did a tour of New Mexican bases in 1947, just after Roswell. So Francis Spellman was involved. James Angleton was talking with Spellman and James Donovan in 1946. The CIA wasn't even around then. Angleton was talking with Spellman and Donovan, and James Angleton was one of the negotiators for the creation of Israel in 1948. He says that in his church committee testimony. So there's a big religious angle here, basically.
Right. Yeah, I can see how deep this rabbit hole goes. And of course, we don't have time to go all the way to its depths. I appreciate all the work you've done to parse the names, dates, places, and you're obviously much a historian of all this. Any other documents come out since the declass effort was stood up, I believe, early last year? Anything that has caught your attention or seemed extremely, notably significant?
There's a bigot list of a secret program that makes no sense. The people on it mostly are not CIA. One of them is Jack Northrop. This document's been released in different iterations over the years. In 1993,
and just to clarify, what is a bigot list?
So a bigot list is a list of people that are briefed into a classified compartment. So you may have a top secret clearance. That does not mean you get access to everything that's top secret. You need a need to know, specific need to know to execute your job, to get access to that information. So you get briefed into a compartment and your name goes on a list. And on the unacknowledged SAT programs, they have this list called a bigot list. And it's spoken about in the Eric Davis Thomas Wilson documents that Wilson's tried to get into the program, the reverse engineering program, and they've said to him, "You're not on the bigot list." So this is a list of people that are cleared to talk about the reverse engineering project. So this document got released April 2025, fully redacted. It's came out in various iterations with different people's names redacted on it, but now there's no redactions. And
okay,
it was part of the JFK assassination files. The assassination investigators put this file in there, and it's got Northrop, it's got undersea submarine warfare experts, it's got geologists, it's got artists, people
okay.
Artists, aircraft artists specializing in combat art.
Okay.
So no one can explain what that document is, what the compartment they've been briefed into is, and why it came out in the JFK files. It's aerospace related because Jack Northrop's on it.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Any other notable drops over the last 12 months?
In the JFK files?
Correct, yes.
There's one that no one wants to talk about, and that's the fact that the CIA were trafficking humans to world leaders in 1959 under Howard Hughes, who was the original Jeffrey Epstein. That was the Family Jewels file. That became declassified, but no one wants to talk about it because of the world leaders that are involved, that are named. It
named
touches a subject.
Power. Named and
the family's still in power.
Okay.
They're 1959s, but the families are still in power. So,
right.
Yeah.
I see. And do you see any relationship to that whole world with the UAP, the special access programs, the legacy program? Is there any connectivity, do you think? Or are these two separate, dark spheres that we have little ability to peer into yet?
Up until the time I heard of Michael Herrera's experience in Indonesia after the earthquake, I would have said no, but hearing what he had to say, I would say yes. Children disappear in natural disasters without a trace. What he encountered makes me believe there's some sort of connection, unfortunately.
Okay. Let's get into the nuclear connection, which is a well documented and well acknowledged reality in UFO history. Looking back over the Cold War, what are some of the key cases you think really call out the depth of involvement regarding crashed vehicles, recovered and reverse engineered technologies, and even potential interaction with whatever intelligence is controlling them? What cases stand out to you?
But the footage of Atlas 8F, the footage of Bluegill Triple Prime, and Bob Jacobs' Atlas 245D and Big Sur in 1964. Like Lou Elizondo saw that footage, so there's actual footage from US government platforms that have collected it. 2 of those have been declassified, perhaps by mistake. The 3rd, they refuse to release it. We know where it is. The US Army refuses to release it because even though Bob Jacobs was Air Force, the US Army looked after the anti-ballistic missile systems back in 1964. So there's footage there, you know.
Yeah, okay.
People can say what they want. It's footage.
Yeah, I'd like to get into the 1962 Bluegill Triple Prime nuclear tests and the resulting UAP takedown. You shared with me some fascinating history and personal testimony from an individual who came in contact with a Navy diver who was tasked on a team with allegedly recovering whatever was downed during that test. Can you just walk viewers through what happened during that test, the relationship to the UAP and the use of a potential directed energy weapon, and what fell out of the sky and what was potentially recovered? And to do so, before we do so, I just want to play back this short selection from that testimony regarding the crashed USO recovery.
So he began to tell me the story about when he was a second-class diver in Pearl Harbor back in 1962. And his group was called away on a top-secret mission 200 miles south of Pearl Harbor, or I don't know if he said that exactly, but he said in the vicinity where a air vessel had gone down. He said air vessel had gone down, and they told him, okay, when you get overboard and you hit bottom, we just want you to observe. So he goes over the side, but he describes when he hits the bottom of the seafloor, and he doesn't realize it. He told me that his back is to whatever he's looking for, and doesn't realize it. He can't believe the size of this thing. He said that he put his hand out. He put his hand out to touch it, and his hand went inside of it. And as soon as his hand went inside of it, he thought that it was going to suck him in. He lost it. I mean, he was really scared. And as soon as his hand went in, he was telling me it was kind of like Jello, but at the same time, it felt like a giant jellyfish. And when his hand went in, as he was pulling his whole arm from the elbow in out, the thing lit up. I mean, he said this gigantic, whatever it was, lit up and started to pulsate with light. It lit up the whole sea bottom. It lit up the whole sea bottom. He saw shadows.
Moving shadows.
Yeah, what appeared to be humanoid type figures, but
humanoid shadows.
No detail. No. And he said when they had like 5 or 6 divers go in to inspect this, and they came up, they had finally measured this thing, and he said it was huge. It was if not longer than an aircraft carrier. Okay, and he said it was cylindrical. They were bringing professionals how to bring this thing up, or how to cut it in two, or how to salvage it. But before they could actually remove it, he had to kind of imagine or make up a story based on just the fragmented pieces he was able to pull together from his shipmates. Okay, that most of them were being shipped out. He told me was this thing at night, and he didn't give a time, but under the cover of darkness in a clear night, this thing glowed with effervescence to a point where the whole ocean lit up. like a neon light bulb or a tube, and it rose above the surface slowly and slow enough to allow the surrounding ships to pull away without falling, being disturbed in a way that they would capsize. And we're talking about escort destroyers and destroyers and other ships in the vicinity that was monitoring this thing with all kinds of devices. And he said it moved so fast under the sea surface without causing great waves. And it went out of sight. It went out of sonar reach. They could not locate it. They couldn't find it. He had about a week before full retirement. And a few days, maybe less than a week, maybe 5 or 6 days before he was due to retire, he got electrocuted in the bathroom and died.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
He died by electrocution. And here's the other kicker. He had a personal yeoman. You know what a yeoman is? A yeoman is somebody who's like your secretary. That the yeoman was typing up a transcript based on all the loose leaf papers and binders and sketches that he had made to make some sense of it, so that when he got out and retired, he could at least do an outline of his story. Okay? So if anybody knew as much as he did about the story, it was this yeoman, right?
Yeah.
And get this. The yeoman was housed in the same barracks I was. And believe it or not, he died also a couple of days before the chief died. He got in an accident going up a hill on Gitmo with his skateboard.
They both?
I have always, yeah, he died too. I always found that kind of strange. What's the worst thing I would want happen to me or my wife if this thing came out? But I'll tell you what, if the CIA is in charge, believe me, you're not going to get iota out of anybody, because they don't pay you off.
Yeah. So take us through the Bluegill Triple Prime incident.
Okay. 1962. Up until that time, actually 1961, August 1961, the Soviet Union had been pretending to negotiate a total ban on atmospheric testing nuclear weapons. They kept, backwards and forwards through the UN. President Kennedy thought they were genuine. So the nuclear weapons teams at Los Alamos, Sandia, and Lawrence Livermore started to back down. The scientists started moving off into other areas, thinking, we're going to have a treaty soon. There's not going to be any more testing. And then all of a sudden, the Soviet Union came out with 45 atmospheric tests in 60 days, culminating with Tsar Bomber, which was a 56 megaton monster. And Khrushchev put this in the New York Times, said, we're going to detonate a 100 megaton bomb. They actually tamped it down, and it could have easily gone to 100 megaton, but they were concerned, surprisingly, about the amount of fallout that it produced. So President Kennedy was caught flat-footed. The entire nuclear weapons industry in the United States panicked because they decided they needed to, test all these exotic weapons that they'd come up with, and they thought they'd never be able to test because of the atmospheric test ban. So then Operation Dominic was formed, and that was a series of 35 tests mostly in the Pacific, just off Christmas Island and a place called Johnson Island, which is sort of west of Hawaii, near the international dateline. There was a few tests in Nevada as well, but the primary area was in the Pacific. And in 1961, a document leaked. They don't know how it leaked. It was from the Rand Corporation, two physicists named the Latter brothers, Richard and Alfred, I think his name was. Albert, sorry. They found a new mechanism that could take out incoming ballistic missiles using high-energy X-rays. So this is different to an EMP weapon. EMP weapons use neutrons to generate the electromagnetic pulse. These weapons develop X-rays. And how they do that is they use gold, physical gold inside the weapons. And these particular weapons they needed to test were called the XW-50X1, and they used a gold sphere. Now that gold sphere was the tamper of the secondary weapon, and I'll just later on, that gold sphere will surface in a movie called The Sphere. It's quite strange how that became part of the story. But anyway, they had these new weapons designs. They needed to test them. The first two tests of Operation Dominic were off Christmas Island in April, 25th of April and 27th of April, 1962. This young sailor named David Noble Whitecrow, who was a part American Indian, he was on board the USS Finch for those two detonations. And he states that the US Navy, after those detonations, told him to go up on the deck of the Finch. It was handpicked to go up on the deck, and they saw this large cylindrical UFO cruise past. And they were, after that, they were debriefed, told never to say anything about what they saw. But I think they needed multiple witnesses. And it was strange that they knew in advance that this craft would cruise by. But anyway, Operation Dominic.
The detonation, that was before the detonation of the high altitude nuclear weapon.
These two were just airdropped. They needed to test the weapon if it actually worked. So they were airdropped from a B-52 off Christmas Island. So they weren't missile tests. They just needed to see if it worked. So David Noble's, he's on the USS Finch at the beginning of Operation Dominic. But just before the Cuban Missile Crisis in September 1962, in the Atlantic Missile Range, they tested an Atlas missile with a dummy warhead. Didn't have a weapon on board, but it just had a re-entry vehicle, and a high-altitude aircraft filmed an object following this re-entry vehicle as it's coming down through space. It's traveling at Mach 18. This object just materializes out of nowhere and paces it for about a minute and a half and then disappears. That footage is in the National Archives. I'm not sure if they accidentally uploaded it, but it's there. They didn't identify which missile test it was. I've identified it. It was the Atlas 8F test. And the post-flight test report has, that states black and white that they filmed objects that don't know what they were, where they were. So these objects have an interest in the nuclear weaponry, the delivery systems. The type of re-entry vehicle is a special type called an AVCO Mark IV. 37 days later, they're doing this high-altitude tests in Johnson Islands using the same warhead that was used in David Noble's case. But this is the 26th of October as well, so it's the very peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, Curtis LeMay's Strategic Air Command is ready to go in. They've gone to DEFCON 2. They've never, ever gone to DEFCON 2 before or since. LeMay wanted to go in, and he wanted to do a first strike capability, and he's on record of saying that he didn't care what the US policy was. It was his policy. He was going to do it. So tensions are ratcheted up so high that, there is a real threat. There's going to be a mass nuclear exchange. They do this Bluegill triple prime test. It's failed 3 times before. It's got 200 kilos of gold on board, so they've just wasted 600 kilos in failed tests. President Kennedy's not happy. He just wants the test over and done with. When they execute this test at 48 kilometres altitude, they're filming it in 2 separate aircrafts, and you can see on the internet it's been declassified. There's an object that tumbles out of that nuclear fireball. They're using high-speed film, 2,500 frames per second. This object tumbles out. It's not the rocket booster. The rocket booster is miles away because this apogee of this RV was like 700 kilometres up. The booster fell away at 187 kilometres height. And that was 14 minutes before the detonation as well. So this object can be seen tumbling out of the sky. And that footage, for whatever reason, has been declassified.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. I look forward to watching that. Now, just to pause here for a second, I took strong note of the testimony of Dr. Harold Malmgren, who came forward, I believe, last year, initially in a series of posts on X, and then a full interview on Jesse Michaels' American Alchemy. He passed away a few days or weeks after that interview was recorded, to my knowledge. So it really was, in a sense, kind of a final testimony. He described he was a staffer, or he had a staff position under JFK, present at the detonation. And I believe his claim, correct me if I'm wrong, was that this test was in part testing the use of a directed energy weapon resulting from the high altitude nuclear blast in order to take down a UAP. Was that part of the purpose of the test, to your knowledge?
I don't think they did it deliberately. They probably knew that there'd be things Harold called them tag-alongs. He said they had a name for them, and they'd seen that in the Atlas test 37 days prior. They didn't know what it was. I don't believe they actually thought they were going to shoot one down, because, as we found out later, they had to scramble a recovery mission from Hawaii to recover the debris.
Okay.
But where David Noble comes into it is he was still in the Navy in 1976 at Guantanamo Bay. He was an engraver in a ship repair department there. And he tells a story of meeting a diver, Master Chief diver, about to retire, who says that at the end of Operation Dominic, which Bluegill Triple Prime was the third last test of that series. The test ended on November 3. Bluegill Triple Prime was October 26. So this diver says that he was on a top secret mission from Pearl Harbor that went out and tried to recover or salvage this object. But they didn't tell him when he was sent down over the side of the ship what he was actually looking for. And he suffered severe psychological trauma and put him in hospital for 18 months.
And we're going to play back that clip. Yep. So viewers will hear his story first. Well, not firsthand, but from the individual who ended up getting his story from him. Pretty fascinating. Yeah. So I was not aware that the attempted recovery of whatever fell out of the sky that day took place at that depth by those potential divers and was ultimately brought up to the surface, as he narrates. And I know Harold Malmgren attests that debris was brought back to a military base stateside, and that there was a deceased entity. Is that right? On board that was recovered?
I believe so. Yeah. I'm not too sure about those details, because it was the Atomic Energy Commission. Harold's initial tweet was about Lawrence Preston Guys, who was head of the Albuquerque operations office for the Atomic Energy Commission at the time, which ran all their nuclear tests. They were transferring to Nevada that year, but at the time he was in charge, and he's actually Jeff Bezos's grandfather. So the materials went back to Sandia Labs at Kirtland Air Base, and that's where Albuquerque operations office was also located, and that's where Harold went. Because President Kennedy visited those sites on December 7th, 1962, only just a little over a month. I don't think they were successful in recovering everything, because, as David Noble recounts, the craft eventually took off. But what his story did was give me some data points for me to track down the actual ships involved, the deck logs of the ships, and this is declassified information. The ships that I've uncovered, and I'm not a sailor, but I know some people that are, and those people are the Honourable Tim Gallaudet, who's a retired Rear Admiral, and his wife, Karen. Karen's a Lieutenant US Navy diver. So I got them to look at the records of the ship involved called the Abenaki. Tim's driven aircraft carriers. He's a deck officer on these supercarriers. He knows how to read ship logs. Karen's a diver. She knows deck log operations, and they both said there's something fishy about this operation. And I've identified the diver, but his family does not want his name published. So I managed to get his service records, and they've obviously altered. I've got evidence that they've altered his records to cover up the fact that he had suffered psychological injuries. And the reason I know that is because
not David Noble, but a different diver.
This was the diver that David Noble spoke to at Guantanamo Bay, the Master Chief that he's talking about.
Right.
Because that guy died less than a week after David Noble met him. And so did his assistant. They died within 2 days of each other, which is strange in itself. Mm-hmm. But that chief diver's records have been altered because he was awarded a specific medal by going by his service records. He could not have been awarded. He was not present. His records say that he was either on leave or it was time not served, but he still got this expeditionary medal for Cuba, which was for the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they've altered his records. That's a fact.
Yeah. Right. Stepping back from some of these detailed case histories, how do you read the relationship between UAP, UFO, and some of these Cold War dynamics and the development and testing of nuclear weapons? What would be kind of your overall reflection upon the relationship?
All sides know of the alien presence. The chief.
And when you say all sides, what do you mean?
So the chief scientist in 1945 on atomic propulsion for aircraft was Chinese. He was worked at the Jet Propulsion Lab. His name was Wan Tseng. He worked under Theodore von Karman. He wrote the entry on von Karman's Towards New Horizons, which was a book that General Hap Arnold got Theodore von Karman and pulled him aside in 1944 and said, we need to try and get all this documentation together and all this information, because they thought they were on the cusp of a new technology. And the Chinese scientist that wrote it, he worked at JPL since the 30s. He had a rank of colonel. He also went into Germany with von Karman. At the same time, Forrestal and Kennedy were in there to see what the Germans had gone. But the House Un-American Activities Committee kicked him out in 1955. He was arrested in the McCarthy era because he was Chinese. So they gifted China the lead person on the reverse engineering project. They just sent him back. And the reason they did that, I believe, is because they didn't know it was that heavily compartmented that they did not realize that their chief person that was reverse engineering the atomic propulsion systems was sending back to China. So, China developed ICBMs and detonated their first nuclear weapon in 1964 because of that guy. Mm. So China's always known. Russia's always known.
And so when you say, all sides have known about the alien presence, would it be your assessment that, Chinese more recently, but earlier on USSR and American leadership knew full well that we were being engaged by a physical non-human entity, presumably biological, or we don't fully know if that's the whole story, but and was there any in your reading of history, was there a power play at hand to try to gain access to the technology first, to weaponize it for prosaic means, or to weaponize it in some sort of defensive posture toward this non-human presence?
I think that's what the race was in Germany in 1945, was to get that technology. The Germans, the Russians, the paperclip scientists, the Soviets got their own German scientists, and that's why they were propulsion experts, and that's why they could launch heavier payloads than the Americans, because they got the German propulsion experts, whereas Werner von Braun and Kurt Debus were more guidance people. So, there's been this, and this is what Tom DeLonge spoke about in 2016, 10 days before the DNC WikiLeaks hack came out that revealed he'd been talking to Generals Neil McCaslin and Mike Carey. He said that the Soviet Union and the Americans were working together to try and get this technology and figure out what was going on. And he claims it was even happening during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, there's this dance around the subject of trying to get that technology.
Have you come across any information that suggests, something akin or specifically the Greada Treaty, the alleged Greada Treaty during the Eisenhower administration, some sort of sit down or agreement might have been made between, for example, elements of the U.S. government and a non-human presence?
Well, the Washington flyover, in military parlance, that's called a show of force. So consecutive weekends in July 1952, something appeared over Washington. They scrambled fighters. There was nothing they could do. So that was a flex saying, here we are. What are you going to do about it? So that probably precipitated some sort of discussion or negotiation with Eisenhower. Eisenhower, I think he was just coming into the administration in 1952. It was the end of Truman's administration. Truman was all over everything because of what happened in 1947. And that's where that Eisenhower briefing document comes from Robert Cutler. And again, Robert Cutler's deputy was a guy named J. Patrick Coyne. J. Patrick Coyne turns up in the Kennedy administration as well. J. Patrick Coyne actually sent that memo to Eisenhower about the briefing meeting because Robert Cutler was out of the country, but he delegated everything to his 2IC, who was J. Patrick Coyne. J. Patrick Coyne was a crony of Alan Dulles. Alan Dulles had been in the UFO game for a long time. When Dulles became director of CIA, he chose General Charles Cabal, who was head of the ATEC Air Force intelligence side that was working at Wright-Patterson on the UFO subject. That's why he picked him as his deputy. So, yeah. There's
signals are screaming all over the dashboard in so many ways.
Yeah.
You've talked recently about your assessment of the MJ-12, the alleged existence of an elite group of individuals who control this issue. I'm curious as to, what do you think is the strongest indications of the existence of this group? Does it still exist? Is it still 12? Is it 20? Is it 24? How would you view the MJ-12 possibility at this point?
I've pretty much identified the source of one of the documents, of the Majestic documents, a whole tranche. His name was, they call him Source S1, but I believe it was a guy named Newton Scotty Myler, who was James Angleton's 2IC. And I've come to that conclusion through analysing handwriting from his CIA personnel records and handwriting on the marginalia of the Majestic documents. So Alan Dulles' calendar from that famous meeting on June 28th, 1961, which is a Majestic documents called the Terse Memo, where Kennedy gets Dulles into his office and says, I want to know about MJ-12 and how they relate to Cold War psychological warfare operations. And, I spoke with Ross about this with palladium. Palladium was declassified years after that document surfaced, and they're talking about palladium in that document. And Dulles' calendar has J. Patrick Coyne going in to meet Dulles at 11 o'clock that day. And I think he is giving Dulles a heads up to say that just JFK is going to ask you about MJ-12 at the 3 o'clock meeting. So just be aware. So Dulles walks into that meeting. He refuses to tell Kennedy anything, and it takes him 7 months to officially write something back. And he basically says, you don't have a need to know. So Kennedy fires him pretty much after that. So, you know,
and
there's so many little details.
And I thank you for making me aware of this. Operation Palladium was simulating aircraft and missile attacks over the USSR by spoofing anomalous aerial activity, potentially UAP or UFO specifically.
Yep. Yeah, so that was part of their plan, because at the time, ICBMs weren't the primary method of delivering nuclear weapons. That was Strategic Air Command. So they had to trick the radar to get in, to get the B-52s in and out, and that was part of what Palladium was. But as Khrushchev says, and again, Dave Chris was a heavy part. He was the lead scientist on Palladium. So he's obviously revealed that under torture, and Khrushchev has learned of this in their first meeting in Vienna. And he says to Kennedy, you better be careful what you're doing, because this could end in a miscalculation and nuclear annihilation. And Kennedy didn't actually know what Khrushchev was talking about, because he hadn't been briefed in on Palladium. So that's where he's come back to the US scratching his head, wanting answers, basically.
Right. Interesting. It's interesting, the triangular nature of this, how, you know, Kennedy and his administration was making overtures to the USSR to collaborate, which of course the CIA would never want. And then of course the CIA is aware of some of its own operatives having been captured and given up key details of their internal workings to the USSR, which JFK and his administration did not know about. And so there is this triangular movement of information. And then of course there is this potential non-human presence, right? And it is up there in the atmosphere. And now, you know, for example, in this operation, we're trying to spoof its activity to gain advantage over adversaries in a preemptive strike scenario, right? And so there are there are these overlapping realities, different players on the stage. And I think over time, you know, it'll be so critical as we get more information in the present to look back on history and revise our understanding of the calculations that were made. And to account for this fourth agent, this fourth presence, the non-human.
Yeah. And obviously, I think Jesse Michaels had a interview recently with a former president of Kazakhstan or something. And this gentleman said that Henry Kissinger was heavily involved all along with the geopolitical nature of the UAP reality. Henry, it's well known that Henry kept his cards close to his chest, particularly in the Nixon administration. You know, it was a toxic atmosphere with H.R. Haldeman and playing games with the CIA, Richard Helms, the DCI. No one trusted anyone, and Henry pretty much held all the cards because, again, he was just a lowly GI in 1945 that could speak German, and they sent him into that secret underground base to debrief the German scientists. That's where his whole career was developed, from that knowledge that he gained.
I want to ask about these Cold War era psychological warfare activities and strategies that were being developed. MK Ultra, you know, has since come out irrefutably. And we've heard more recently, like from Michael Herrera, testimony regarding children in the third world or in rural or tribal areas with psionic capabilities being taken, abducted, essentially, trafficked, and being used in certain black budget programs as a psionic or a psychic asset. We've also heard from Dan Sherman, you know, regarding this alleged Project Preserve Destiny, which is as well cultivating these intuitive communicators, in this case, to actually engage with the gray, I'm not sure it was with the Greys. It was called a Grey project. So I want to distinguish that, but it was to actually engage and coordinate with a non-human set of forces. So do you see these psychological warfare tactics, the development of psionics, the potential interface with NHI as coalescing in a nexus? Or should we be considering these as different kind of, events taking place with an unknown relationship at this point?
Unfortunately, I think Dr. Joseph Mengele's horrific experiments focused on twins because of their known psychic ability. They seem to be able to communicate somehow without talking, and his experiments focused primarily on that ability, which possibly could have been a result of what they found in the Magenta crash with no obvious signs of control of the craft. They probably figured out it was some psionic capability. Mengele had this obsession with blue eyes as well. He actually tried to change people's eye color in horrific tests on children again. So, and Alan Dulles had a big part in Joseph Mengele escape because he was held prisoner in a prison camp in Germany. They knew who he was, what he did, but somehow he still managed to escape to South America. And Peter Dale Scott wrote a really good article in 1985 called "Why No One Could Find Mengele, Alan Dulles and the German SS," because Dulles was facilitating the paperclip. Scientists, Hans Kammler was another one that was a tunneling expert. That he seemed, supposedly committed suicide, but there's been whistleblowers come out on their deathbed and say, like former Army counterintelligence corps people saying that they actually expedited Kammler out of Germany and was working for the US. So that I believe that's why disclosure is going to take a massive effort to happen, because there's some bad things that happened in the past on both sides that no one wants to admit, because it'd be a propaganda coup for their adversaries if it came out that, and even, if there was a military or intelligence personnel that conspired to assassinate the commander-in-chief, that's treason. And some of those people are buried at Arlington. So that would be a massive crisis, because you'd have to dig those people up. You can't have traitors buried in Arlington. And that's why they just don't want to go there. And there's been this push for an amnesty, basically. We'll just forget about the past. What happened, and let's just move on.
Yeah. How do you view the current declassification efforts? What are you looking ahead to? What do you think might be possible to come out to the public in the months and years ahead?
As that document from the Carlisle Barracks from Donovan's file show, they've gone through them with a fine-tooth comb many times. So the JFK files, the good stuff's not even in those files, because Angleton had his own filing system. They didn't even go to the central repository. So, and that's where the burned memo is, comes from. They were from Angleton's safe, and it actually says on the front cover there, "Do not remove from safe JJA," which is James Jesus Angleton. So
unlikely.
Only those documents.
See documents released under the current administration that are dramatic, revelatory.
But that bigot list one, no one can explain what that is. And what are they? What were those people briefed into? That there's tens of thousands of documents that got released, but this document was the only one that didn't have a cover letter in front of it to say what it was about. It just got released as a single page list of people's names. So that is
related to any aerospace project or any defense or intelligence community special access program, right?
Well, there was the CIA, Thomas Karamessinis, Dave Christ was on there. There's a whole heap of people that are got a known cloud over their backgrounds in the CIA are on this list, plus a whole heap of people that no one's ever heard before and wondering,
Right.
well, why would you need a artist that specializes in aircraft to be briefed into that compartment?
Right. Well, we're left to wonder, as always, how it connects in. We're going to get into some of the deeper aspects of this rabbit hole in part 2 of our conversation, Geoff. Specifically, I'd like to look at this clip from the Ross Coulthard interview you did early last year, where you brought up some very interesting possible scenarios that have been considered as it relates to NHI. Let's have a listen.
To be told about the JFK assassination that the CIA is holding on to?
Definitely, yeah. Obviously, going through the records, 70,000 pages, I believe there is. For instance, one that was released fully was regarding the MK Naomi biological warfare program that the CIA worked with the US Army Biological Warfare Center at Fort Detrick, and the CIA had their own reserves of biological warfare agents to deploy if needed. And that leads into the infamous burned memo that was supposedly snatched from the fire after Richard Helms in 1973 ordered all incriminating material be destroyed. And this document was snatched from the fire, and it actually says, in the case of UFOs actually making overt, displays of themselves, there's a series of directives that we are to take in that instance, and one of them was the initiation of dispersion of biological warfare agents throughout the community, to start MK Ultra mind control activities, such as a sub-program called Artichoke. That was the plan. And it names Lancer, which was the Secret Service code name for President Kennedy. It says if President Kennedy keeps asking hard questions, we need to assassinate him.
So, Geoff, that definitely caught my ear, and I look forward to getting into that with you in part 2 of the conversation. We'll talk about the implications of biological agents being released into the community upon some kind of NHI or non-human manifestation of presence, the use of MK Ultra, and the potential connectivity to the current interest in psionic individuals, psionic assets. And I'd like to also get your take on the intelligence behind UAP, its potential intent, and we'll just talk further about the possibility that this fourth actor on the stage, this non-human actor, is exerting some form of passive or intentionally active influence on anything from world leaders to military agencies and their directorate, or larger groups of people as a whole. So thank you so much for joining me on Emergent for this part 1 conversation with Geoff Cruickshank. Head over to YouTube members, become a member, and listen to part 2 of the conversation. And with that, I look forward to seeing you next time.